Welcome to today's class about Diogenes, a very famous Cynic philosopher. We're going to continue now with some post-Socratic philosophers. I will talk about Socrates, but I'll do him when I talk about Plato, because most of what he said is written in Plato's books. Diogenes, most of what he did, rather than wrote, because he didn't really write anything, he led by example. So most of what he did was written down by another guy, also called Diogenes. So it's rather confusing. A guy called Diogenes Laertius, who wrote a book called The Lives and Opinions of the Eminent Philosophers. So you don't mix those two up, first of all. But this guy is the Cynic philosopher, and he's very famous. He's a fun character. I think it's hard not to like him because he was a bit of a rebel. So firstly, he was exiled from his hometown of Sinope, and this was because he debased the currency. Now, there's actually historical evidence for this. His father, according to Diogenes, was a guy called, being honest, I've forgotten, and I'll probably pronounce it incorrectly, Hicesius. And this guy's, his father's name, his father was a banker. Well, his father's name has been found on coins from that period. So it sounds very much like this is confirming his existence and as a son of a banker. And secondly, a large number of coins from Sinope have been found to have been defaced or smashed in some kind of way to reduce the metal content, I assume. And so this story seems to be backed up by historical fact. Now, according to this Diogenes Laertius, he went to the Oracle of Delphi, which was like a priestess who would give you advice, I suppose, about life, and she told him to debase the currency. And he firstly did this in Sinope. He was exiled for this criminal act, and he went to Athens. And it was in Athens that he decided that the Oracle of Delphi had actually not been referring to money when she said debase the currency, but she'd been referring to the values of society. And so really he should be debasing the way people live, what they value around them. And so yeah, he didn't really write anything down. He led by example. When he first arrived in Athens, he lost his slave called Manes, and he wasn't at all upset about this. People told him that his slave had got away and was getting away, and he said that if Manes can live without Diogenes, then it would be terrible if Diogenes couldn't live without Manes. And so you get this idea of self-sufficiency, this idea that if you depend on someone, even if it's your slaves, if you depend on your slaves, you're no longer their true master. Really, you're a slave to them because you become dependent on them. And he had a similar idea about wealth and luxuries, that if you surround yourself with wealth and luxuries, you kind of become a slave to these simple material objects. Anyway, he also started to follow his new teacher around, Antisthenes, like a dog. And the Cynics, the word actually is related to the word dog in Greek. They were called the dog philosophers, and because there were more than just Diogenes, he's just the most famous one. And there were a number of reasons for this. 4 different reasons have been given that I've found out. So like dogs, they're indifferent to social conventions, and they perform all their bodily functions in public. This is another thing which Diogenes is quite famous for, and perhaps this is why he wouldn't be too much fun to have around. But yeah, like dogs, they did that. Also, dogs are pretty shameless, and shamelessness, according to the Cynics, is better than modesty. The Cynics saw something very honest in shamelessness, in not being ashamed to perform what you would normally do in private, in public. And so shamelessness was something which Diogenes is famous for, really. Also, like dogs, he instinctively knows his friends from his enemies. This is another thing which is another compliment given to the Cynics, that they know their friends and their enemies, and they bark at their enemies, and they are kind and loving to their friends. And lastly, they guard their philosophy just like a guard dog. So a number of different reasons were given for why they were called the Cynics. Also, I think Antisthenes studied in an academy which was related to the root of this word, and maybe it comes from that. There could be several different reasons. But yes, one of the main parts of being a cynic was the ascetic training. So like many saints after them, like in many religions, they renounced a lot of luxury and the things which we all take for granted, like a house and food on our plates. They would renounce that in order to improve themselves spiritually in some kind of way. So some of the stories that are told about him: he hugged cold statues in winter, but in summer he rolled his water barrel around in hot sand. This was to get tough, simply to get physically fit. He even said concerning his body, he said, "All that I testify to, my body testifies to as well." And he's trying to point out that his body shows how physically healthy his mind is, and that this is a healthy form of behavior to do this. It toughens you up. So he is supposed to be a very healthy guy. Secondly, yeah, you can see shamelessness was part of the training. You were not supposed to hide anything, because hiding things was considered in some kind of way a weakness or a bad thing to do. And so everything was done in public. He slept and ate anywhere he chose, and when they asked him where he was from or what allegiance he confessed, he said he was a citizen of the world. He was one of the first people to use the word cosmopolitan, and this was to really show that he was not connected to the Athenians or the Persians or the people of Sinope. He was his own man, and he just considered himself to be part of the world. Excuse me. Okay, and lastly, as I've already mentioned, he renounced all of these things. He led a life of frugality, and you get the impression this is because he saw more freedom in a life like this, when you're not tied to the things around you in any kind of way. And he didn't have a wife or children or anything like that, so he also had no kind of familial ties like this. Okay, he's very famous for his encounter with two people. Firstly, with Plato. Plato said at one of his public presentations, he said that Socrates defined man as a featherless biped. So something that walks on two legs, that's what biped means, without feathers. And so Diogenes, in order to make fun of pretentious philosophers like Plato, he plucked a chicken and took it into the marketplace and said, "Behold Plato's man," or Socrates' man, whoever you like, but he just plucked a chicken, because a chicken without feathers is of course also a featherless biped. And the story goes, according to Laertius, that Plato then added the extra condition with broad flat nails, and hoped that that would perhaps rescue his definition of man. Okay, he's of course famous as well for his meeting with Alexander the Great. This is perhaps the most famous story about him. Alexander the Great, when he went into Corinth, he wanted to meet Diogenes, because Diogenes was already the famous philosopher who lived in a barrel and had renounced all his wealth. And Alexander said, "What can I do for you? Tell me your wish and I'll grant it." And Diogenes just said, "Get out of my son." And this shows that he had no fear of rank. All men for him were his equals. And Alexander seemed to take a shine to him. He said, "If I were not Alexander, I should wish to be Diogenes." And Diogenes is supposed to have replied, "And if I were not Diogenes, I should also wish to be Diogenes." Second story about him with Alexander is the bones of Alexander's father. Diogenes was looking at some bones, and Alexander said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm searching for the bones of your father, but can't distinguish them from those of a slave." Now obviously this is a very rude thing to say about someone's father. It shows he really has no fear of rank. Again, it's the same kind of his disdain for authority. He didn't consider any man to be his superior. Lastly, there's a funny story when Alexander wakes him up with a Homeric quote. He quotes him, "A man charged with making decisions shouldn't sleep the night away." Diogenes actually responds with the rest of the Homer quote. He says, who has the people in his care and so many concerns. And so thereby he proves that he wasn't asleep and that he was a person charged with making decisions, and he was the perfect leader that Homer describes in that quote, who is looking after his people. So in a sense, he is a leader of men, Diogenes, just like Alexander is a leader of men. It's one of my favourite stories. So I think Diogenes is there to remind us that a life of luxury and comfort and wealth is not necessarily superior to a life of poverty, hardship, and even shamelessness. And in some senses, I think he succeeds in proving that it's actually healthy to lead a hard life, a life full of difficulties, obstacles, challenges. It's necessary, and the opposite kind of life with no obstacles and no challenges is inferior because it weakens you, it makes you less healthy. And I think I would also add that he shows us that there's a lot of freedom in this kind of life, in the sense that he can say what he likes to who he likes. I mean, he speaks to Alexander the Great like his equal, not like his superior. And so there's a certain amount of freedom in living without wealth, possessions, luxury. You're not tied to these things. You don't depend on these things, and you grow used to living without them. I'll leave you with one other thing which he said concerning dogs. Other dogs bite their enemies, I bite my friends to save them. I think he felt like he was of some use to society, even though he was abhorred by a lot of people, especially his behaviour, his shameless behaviour. He felt that he was helping people in some kind of way. Okay, well, we'll be moving on to the Stoics in future, and the Epicureans, and Plato and Socrates as well. But if you have any questions, or you'd like to make a point about anything which is said in this lesson, or you'd like to discuss it, please put your points below the video, and I look forward to reading them. Thanks for watching.